Hello, everyone. We'll get started very shortly. For the folks on the Adobe Connect, please note there is no dial information for direct connectivity to a phone line. It has to be through the device that you connected. As Because we are actually simultaneously streaming this, we'll be streaming this webinar to the folks out there on YouTube. All right, so welcome everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'd like to wish you good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be. As I mentioned already, there is no direct phone line from a connectivity standpoint, as we're simultaneously streaming this webinar to the folks on the YouTube world. Today's webinar is Get Enterprise Provisioning Right, and the introductions, obviously, I'm be the one conducting this webinar. My name is Alex Minotto, a product manager within the One Identity group. I'm responsible for identity and access governance within our product portfolio. There will be a section for Q&A as well. So at any point in time, if you have questions, feel free to input or write your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to those questions as promptly as possible. If I see it's related to the topic that we're speaking, I'll probably answer right away. If not, we may have to leave it until the end of the presentation. Okay, without further ado, I guess we'll get started. All right, the whole essence of how to get enterprise provisioning right. I mean, it really comes down to your identity manager and access management process, and really taking the risk of some of those initiatives. And when we're talking about risk, a good way to start to understanding where the risk and where to consider is really kind of breaking that down and looking at the realities in which the organizations face on a regular basis, right? So if you look at distributed, the days of days are pretty much gone. Those days of complete centralized workforce are gone. You have employees that are now working remotely. You have employees that are traveling on a regular basis. You have different development groups from different organizations, well distributed, that need to be able to then provide functions. For the biggest examples for me is today. I'm a remote employee. I'm actually sitting in my home office, and I'm able to then connect to the various resources that I'm required to perform my daily task. And at the same time, I never go into an office of sorts. So that's something that is typical now. You will see more and more the issues that can potentially affect. As a remote employee that never goes into an office, I need to be able to do my certain things, which if it is access to certain applications, or if I'm starting a new job, for example, how do I get that functionality in place as we go? Not only distributed workflow comes in play, but the distributed applications and more specific cloud these days, right? So you look at these realities, the days of just the on-prem applications where you had to provision and enable users to gain access to those applications are gone. The cloud has opened a different set of issues as well, because the applications are growing exponentially, or the access to those applications is growing exponentially, and IT often is not even aware of the fact that these applications are there, and as a number of users starting to gain traction, and you have to then more and more users have to log in or have to have access to those applications, then it becomes a part of the IT department to actually have to then bring those in and have some sort of more a formal process, not just from a provisioning standpoint, but obviously deprovisioning. A lot of the cloud applications have license subscriptions restrictions with that, right? So do do you want to be able to enable? Do you want to start paying for those license where when individual users are not accessing those types of applications? So it's just money going out door. And at the same time, how do you then provide that layer of governance and be able to then automate the processes as your users leave the company? How do I automatically deprovision so that those users get automatically removed from access to those types of applications? So if we take the assumption, right, of distributed and rapid changing workflows is one of the actual kind of issues that you have to encounter. Require access to the variety of applications, either both on-site and on the cloud. The big question is, and where does provisioning comes into play, which obviously is what really at the end of the day, what provisioning does is really it allows you to, or basically ensures that the right people will get the right access to the right business resource at the right time. And then how do you get that? By obviously by getting your provisioning right. And if you look at right from the start, primarily if you look at provisioning itself, it primarily occurs at really at the critical point of an employee's relationship with the enterprise. When an employee joins, when an employee actually moves or changes job description or move from one department to another, and of course when the employee leaves the enterprise as well. If you look at the first of these, joining from a joiner's perspective is really talking about onboarding, provisioning set of employees with the right set of access, right for the capabilities so that they can perform that particular function on day one, right? So you have your HR initiated process where that information gets populated. The information then would be then absorbed by an identity management system or manual processes that you may have. There are companies out there that have not implemented any type of identity management tools to automate some of these steps. However, so the provisioning aspect is still done still done manually. So in from that perspective, an individual user that joins a company today perhaps may take weeks or even sometimes months before he or she has been provisioned or added to the right set of applications that is required for them to do their job. And it's incredible, but we still see that often in some organizations. So the initial joiners and movers and leavers type of role plays an integral part of getting your provisioning right from the get-go, which which then follows the overall user lifecycle and provisioning aspect, right? So if I look at and we kind of take the time to kind of look at break down those relevant use cases. We briefly talk about joiners, where HR initiated type of process, where an HR manager inputs information into a system. That system then synchronizes through an identity management product. The identity management product, in that sense, would already have a set of roles or kind of security policies or access type of policies, which would be applied then to those individual users for them then to gain access to the various resources they have. Movers and leavers, obviously, movers is with the overall, it really plays more of a part of the overall life cycle of an end user, where you have to have a way to quickly makes if you make some changes to a particular user attribute or a particular role to an individual user, then the ability for them to inherit that in a fast and efficient way. And of course, from a leaver standpoint, that's critical from a deprovisioning standpoint, but really plays well with the overall user lifecycle, where you need to make sure that the deprovisioning aspect does not get forgotten as more and more individual users leave your company. You need to make sure you have a proper process in place that you ultimately not only disable that individual user, however, you do the due diligence that's needed to actually remove access from those individuals is by removing the roles that perhaps pertain to them, or perhaps remove the direct access that those individuals receive throughout their life cycle within the company. Then follows really from a, if you're looking, it's just the pure provisioning aspect of that. It then kind of breaks down uh, into about, there's probably more, I guess, if you take consideration of a manual process that could be accomplished as well. If you're looking more of an automated way, and as you use and you'll start utilizing some of the identity and management products out in the market, you normally face, and this is faced with about 4 different provisioning kind of initiatives, which I've kind of listed here on this slide. So straight through provisioning, request-based provisioning, role-based provisioning, attribute role kind of based provisioning. Those tends to be the most popular that we have seen and have worked with a lot of customers out in space. And I'll go into more details to each of these use cases and how that is kind of conveyed and utilized by customers, and how they initiate those via an identity management system. But the most often, as we've seen here, straight through request and role-based provisioning. I guess from a starting standpoint, the RBAC, or the role-based provisioning, plays a significant role on the overall provisioning aspects. Right, straight through provisioning. So the whole idea of this is something that is starting to, we're seeing more and more with a lot of the customers that we work with. This requires some level of expertise and a really well-rounded organizational requirements. It's being able to map your organization to the actual access and resources that those individuals have. So this is really comes down to the day zero when as you can see here, HR data from particular gets populated into whatever the HR system that you have. At that point in time, a automated process that is defined based on a particular function role for the end user. It's then assigned to the user right from just even it's from the day of the fact that the account, from day one where the account gets actually provisioned. That functional role is then assigned either a birthright role or just more of a functional role that's based on the function or based on the role within the employee and the organization, and then transport, which transcends the user having access to whatever it's required right from day one. We're starting to see some of that, as I mentioned before. It is done right through at the often. Pretty much for the straight through provisioning to actually really work, and you have benefit of that. It is done at the time of joiner, and often enough part of the lever process. Because within in between, you then have your management of role that should be followed on a regular basis. The request-based provisioning is very popular as well. So if you look at that is post. So if once a user is already in the system, the user has already been provisioned to the initial set of roles that they require to perform the daily activity, there's going to be that need or that way in which these individuals may have to request access to other resources, right? If, for example, your initial role for that particular user that has just joined the company the initial is to create an account, create a mailboxes, and perhaps if it's part of the finance group, to add he or she to those finance resource groups. That could be initial step of that. And then you can open it up the other provisioning initiatives via the request management portal, where you would then provide the resources, which the user then will have the flexibility of request depending on the needs and the level of maturity within the organization. For example, if I'm a everyday user that does not travel or does not do expenses, from this screenshot, perhaps I don't need to have the ability to request access to Concur, right? Or perhaps for depending on what other applications, or excuse me, perhaps depending on the title on the what do I need to do, then I may have to request other things as well. And this could be either uh, a automated way, or the request can be auto fulfill at the point of request, or perhaps you perhaps then you would need to embed some sort of a workflow and approval mechanisms as well, so that once a user requests access to the particular application, before you actually can provision that user to gain access to the application, it would follow some sort of approval workflow where an individual then the application owner or the group owner perhaps would then have to then approve, and once that is approved, then the fulfillment mechanism takes place in the back end, and obviously a notification to the end user saying that they now have been provisioned to that particular resource, and if it require credentials, then here's the credentials and the password to actually access the information. If AD integrated, obviously use the same credentials that you'll be using on a regular basis. All right. With that, especially from, if you are going to implement web or request-based provisioning, and that's part of the everyday activities, then you will require to have a means of being able to provide that functionality to your end users in the various form factors that are available. Obviously, as I mentioned, with the fact that you have distributed workflows, you can have remote users logging in to the network, or perhaps using the whole notion of being able to bring their own, even if they're logging in in the from the network itself. A lot of companies have allowed the notion of bring your own devices, where you have individuals no longer just using laptops, but using different tablets or even their smartphones in order to request access to certain resources. And with that in mind, if you are going to create this model, a request-based provisioning model, where you're going to empower your end users to request access to those resources, it would be extremely beneficial for you to be able to provide a way that they can request those resources, via their laptop or desktop, but also via their smartphones or tablets, and so that the end user itself can get quickly, based on the request, and if he or she requires to gain access to resource to perform some work-related activity, they can make those requests pretty much instantaneous, and the fulfillment of that can really take its course, and then provide that level of access to the end user at a much faster pace than we have done it and seen in the past. Now comes RBAC, right? So this is the ones that is kind of critical in a lot of organizations, and this is the one as well, this kind of provisioning process that has created a lot of havoc in the industry. Even though it's really provides a very flexible access management administration approach, right? If because at the end of the day, it's trying to do is implement control based on your organizational function of the user. Really, RBAC is the only kind of way that you can provide the access to the end user based on their job and nothing more. So you can actually really tailor the way the individual is provisioned or gain access to a certain application by configuring these set of access management type of controls. Now, as I said before, even though RBAC is very prevalent and more organizations are trying to achieve a level for their ongoing provisioning initiatives, it has a has failed tremendously within our industry. I've I mean, I can't count the number of individual customers that I have spoken in the past that attempted to do RBAC or started doing role-based provisioning, but have not gone very far, and also maybe created more issues internally than just by providing a very simple joiner's role to empower the user to gain access to whatever they need at first, and then provide a method of a request, a more of an access or web-based request management for the ongoing provisioning of other resources. Now, I mean, I still think that RBAC is, as I said, is the most flexible way to do that. It is, I mean, if you look at it, it is focused on role development, meaning that you need to really understand the types of access rights that is required on the creation of those particular roles, right? So you need to understanding of how your organization itself function so that you can create a role and assign the correct level of access for those users, right? If, and the greatest benefit of being able to actually create this type of provisioning, a role-based type of provisioning, is the fact that once a role is set up, so when you've gone through your organizational functions and you have isolated and you have actually then figure out how to map that to that based on those job functions to an actual role, once you set that up and you approve, the user then gets provisioning. The user, it becomes a very simple way of not just assigning those access to those users, but also the ongoing access and administration aspect of that, right? So as I mentioned, once the role is assigned to the user, is either assigned by perhaps a straight through provisioning right from the day that the individual joins the company, or perhaps is assigned as part of ongoing process, perhaps on behalf of a manager that requests a particular role because a new user has joined his group. And the once this is set up and has been approved, the user obviously is going to be provisioned as a member of the role, and not only a member of the role, but any roles that are associated with his or her job function, right? As I mentioned, and how does this evolve uh, later on? I mean, obviously, role management is something that you have to do on a regular basis. You have to continuously be looking of the actual role itself, and because, as you all know, organizations changes, and with organizational changes, you can't have that same static type of role that once you create it. You have to adapt those roles in the same way that your organization changes, so that the up to date roles reflects that, and ultimately then provision those end users with the right level of access that is required from them to perform their daily activity, right? Now, with obviously we have talked about the fact that you need to kind of map your organizational needs into these sets of access rights so that you can actually evolve and build these roles with the right level, granular level of access, and then the ongoing management of that. But the role management or the RBAC from especially from a provisioning standpoint, in order for you to actually have a full success and in order to actually have a full implemented way that your organization can benefit, it needs to be, and often enough, folks don't consider that. You need to make sure it's tied in with your end access management lifecycle, right? So often enough, you're only thinking of, well, hey, I want to map out my organizational needs and access for those individuals, and I want to assign those to to the right folks. However, There are times that it could be a one-to-one correlation where you can auto assign the roles and therefore auto provision the access to those individual users. But there's going to be cases where it requires to have a kind of approval workflow in place. It may require a access request fulfillment mechanism in place as well. So even though you have created this nice role management, if you don't apply that at that time of that joiner at that time, you need to also then provide a method which the end user can then request instead of requesting direct access to a particular resource. It would then be requesting access to a role, which obviously then will turn and assign the right level of permissions or the right level of access that's required for the end user, so that ongoing from an administration standpoint, all you need to be concerned is that whenever I have organizational changes, I go back and I make the necessary changes at the role level, and then automatically whatever changes that I have made to that role will be inherited by the end users that actually have been assigned those particular roles. So it's really imperative that you just don't think of a role-based access you know, it's a one-all type of thing. It needs to be fully integrated, as I said, with your access management lifecycle. It needs, you need to integrate with the access request workflow provisioning, and then obviously access certification, which that's a total topic on its own as well. That we can spend time talking about this, but plays a massive role in the overall role-based type of access certification or base provisioning, because as you create these roles, the notion that you will have to assign some sort of ownership of those roles as well. So somebody will have to maintain and make sure he understands the organizational changes and updates the role from an ownership standpoint. That individual as well will have to then have the task of ongoing certify not just the access level of that particular role, but also the individuals that have gained that or have been assigned that role. So it's, these individuals require to have that same level of access. And by, through various access certifications initiatives or campaign, uh, this becomes an automated way in which you then provision or deprovision the right level of access to those end users, right? But really, access request, like I said, plays a major role here, but it's something that it's a different topic that could be taken in consideration. And of course, now too, not just role-based access control is being prevalent in the market. The whole notion of metadata or attribute-based provisioning too is becoming more prevalent, and you even see customers using the combination of RBAC and ABAC and but you need a system. It becomes because it provides a deeper level of granularity, because you're going down to that metadata level where you would then need to make sure you can map out your organizational needs. Especially if you have this really plays well around movers and when you have individuals moving from one department to another, or even from an office to an office, especially now with the various compliance initiatives or GDPR, especially coming up next year in EMEA, where it may be part of a different a particular department, but that department could be also segregated within the different localities where that department is, and the level of access of those particular resources may vary as well. So there's going to be a need, depending on the complexity in the compliance initiatives that you have to abide by, that you may have to implement down to the level, down to an attribute level where in the moment that that attribute triggers or it changes from an individual, it triggers a backend process where we'll then either provide provision more access to an end user or perhaps remove the access for that particular user. All right, so we talked about how to get provisioning to the point and the different levels of how to automate provisioning. By from just the fact that as individuals join the company or leave the company or move within the company, but other types of provisioning initiatives that you may want to take place. So if you already have a solution in place, then obviously you should be looking at your identity management solution for those types of use cases, and how those use cases, then how can you fulfill those use cases based on your organizational needs as you map out the organizational needs and figure out which one of those kind of provisioning initiatives best benefit your company or your end users. But now, if you already have something in place, obviously you may have to look at it. How, is the IAM or the IGA solution that you have giving you the best model to be able to execute and have a good uh, um, provisioning initiatives within your organization. But if you were looking at so at a high level, I mean, really, if you're looking at a solution in place, what are you looking for? Well, obviously, you need to be looking at a full feature type of solution, right? It's not just the ability to provide role management. It's role management, provisioning. We didn't talk too much about that, but provisioning really has two sides. One is the level of access. It's the initiation of what type of access the user is going to end up having, and then it requires some sort of fulfillment mechanism in the back end to do that, right? So if perhaps if the role assignment tells me that I need to be part of an Active Directory group, for example, which then will give me access to an Active Directory application, well, that's the start. Whereas the fulfillment mechanism takes place, which then requires to have an identity management system that can connect to Active Directory and properly provision or properly, in this case, update group memberships so that I can, so that the process becomes a seamless process at the end. Uh, and this is where a single platform can really help, because it's truly provisioning, fulfillment, and then of course the other embedded initiatives that will be required, especially moving forward as you developed uh, this role management capabilities for your ongoing provisioning. Well, as I mentioned before, there's definitely going to be a need for you to then assign ownership and do the ongoing certification, or basically the ongoing review of those access. And once again, if the organization changes over time, obviously you have to make sure that you make those necessary changes. So you have to have in place a method or an instrument that can correlate all those informations and can also um, allows you to not just take care of the provisioning aspect, but also any initiatives that will come along with it. I'm more of part of the overall governance and how do I, certification campaigns and things of that nature. How do I connect to other target systems as well, right? Onboarding becomes a huge part of that. If part of my identity management process is I haven't onboarded a particular application, well, then it becomes difficult to automate the actual provisioning aspect, to the application itself. So onboarding of new applications becomes a critical path as well. And as we mentioned in one of my first slides, it's in the growth of the cloud applications as well, even increases uh, the overall kind of risks that are associated with with identity and access management processes, right? Because if you look at it, right, cloud applications are growing exponentially, as I mentioned. You have to have a proper and quick way to actually onboard these applications in order for you to have an automated provisioning. You know, in order for you to automate in the provisioning aspects of not just the on-prem but cloud applications, you need to have a method of actually understanding what the application is and the types of access that the application have, and you have to have that incorporated as part of your identity management processes. So that all, and when I said before that, considering provisioning is not just it's an end-to-end access management lifecycle, yeah, because you have to incorporate other functionalities in order for you to get that provisioning right. As we're the whole essence of the conversation here is around that. In it, you know, uh, obviously your solution needs to be flexible in a way that can adhere to your models and also be able to grow. If you're starting with very simple kind of a joiner based roles where it provides the basic necessities, and then perhaps you would then do the rest of the provisioning based on a request model. Well, obviously you want a tool that's able to do that. And as you mature, perhaps, and you start implementing a more robust role-based or even potentially an attribute-based access control, you need to have a set of tools that actually are able to grow and are flexible to grow with your needs as well, right? Includes risk management for access certification, which I mentioned before. And really, at the end of the day, you need something that is customizable without developing. There's is incredible. Uh, is really incredible to see how many applications, or sorry, how many vendors out that in the space provides the level of that capability, but very limited in how you can customize without actually having to develop, right? Because the moment that you have to bring in develop or have to have a development team to actually start developing these roles, or they have to map out these access to these endpoints or these target systems, well, then you just then increase the overall level of complexity of this of your provisioning initiative. So something to keep in mind is that, you know what, I need a flexible way to do that, but at the same time, I may need to customize. I may need to make some changes that best match my organizational needs in an easy and intuitive way without actually potentially getting myself into a corner that I may not be able to back out, right? Because if it's heavily coded, and that person, if we have to then subcontract an individual, or perhaps that person leaves the company, then all the knowledge has left with that individual as well, uh, and then it becomes very difficult for you to try to maintain that. So really, at the end, so we're really what it comes down to, right? Getting provisioning right. Well, as we mentioned before, you need to align your organization requirements. Um, Even if it's a simplistic way, even if it's just a pure, initial HR data that, well, or the amount of data that is inputted as part of the HR process, that could be consumed by an identity management product. The 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 ability to actually, if you can, include hierarchy and job details really will help you leverage that and help you define the initial set of roles that you could have in place as early as day one for for joiners, and even depending on the actual level of job function, a more defined and set of access right from the get-go, and not have to then look at and then further define later on. Um, Really, the provisioning really, as we talk, it relates to roles, right? It relates how you assign. At the end of the day, the provisioning is not just adding Creating an account is also providing access to the certain applications in whatever in the right level of access, so that individual can perform their task based on their job function. So make it easy, recognizable access, so it can be reused. Once again, the whole idea that we talked about is that I need to be able to, on an ongoing basis, revisit the role, look at the access of that particular role and what function that does perform. And then if the organizational needs changes, I need to be able to change that. But I need to be able to change it in a nice and easy way. I need to be able to recognize exactly what that role entails and what is the ultimate outcome of that role, so that if I make changes, the changes that I make, it still falls within my organizational needs. 80/20 rule, obviously, it sounds redundant, but there are times there's been, you need to be flexible in a way that you are not going to be able to define every possible situation for that particular role in order to provision a certain application, right? um, you have to, because this is the area that a lot of customer fails, is that they try to implement 100% rule, so 100% match, and with that in mind, then you start growing. The number of roles that you have becomes very granular and becomes a greater, and then at the same time, then it becomes very functional to an individual user role. Whereas if you take that 80/20 rule, you could get a way of having a role specific that would be able to solve to a much broader um, number of users initially, and then you can augment that by providing that request access provisioning via those entitlements that you can actually present as part of ongoing the needs for those ongoing those users. So you know that is something that we've seen as well. Try to minimize the potential impacts that you have later on, especially as your organization changes. You need to be able to adhere to that. Continue to refine roles over time. Obviously, that's something that I've kind of reiterated the fact that you need to refine over time. You need to look at it. You can't create. You don't think that creating a role from a provisioning standpoint today will remain the same for the entire life, for many years to come. Some will have to change. As I mentioned, it really reflects based on the organizational changes that you have within your company. And as your organizational changes, then you have to reflect those changes into the roles that you assign, so that at the end, the provision that is being taken place is being done the right way. And uh, last but not least, I mean, ownership is huge, right? So if you are going to be creating these roles, you need to assign ownership to each of these roles. There has to be somebody that understands the correlation to what that role provides, what type of access that role provides, and has to be able to understand the organization. And if organizational changes occur, he or she then can tailor and change the role, so that it can continue to match the organizational needs. And of course, really plays another huge play around the ongoing certification, which is, it's kind of a different topic, access certification, but providing and having ownership of that particular role uh, will then lead to empowering those users to actually then do revisit and look at the roles and who has access to those roles, to make sure that the individuals that have access to the roles should have access to the roles. So you're empowering that and obviously that will increase your overall audits and compliance, because you'll have a method to actually not understand what the role does from an access standpoint, and really map out exactly how the provisioning will occur if I do end up assigning a role to an individual user. But it also gives me that flexibility from audit standpoint, that is being, that we're actually periodically looking at the level of the access, and we're making sure that the right individuals have the right level of access, and then and revoke if not necessary, and have a detailed audit trail that at any point in time we can go back and take a look at that. And obviously, as you know, implementing the whole process of review, it's something that ownership would probably take place of that. All right, so I didn't see any queue questions, so I want to open up for any questions that any folks may have. And I think the only method of providing a question is through the Q&A window, whereas there's no, as far as I understand, there's no audio. We don't seem to have seen any questions come in here. Give another 10 seconds. If there's no questions, then I would like to end this webinar by thanking everyone that has attended. I know everybody is busy and taking time of your daily activities to watch a webinar series. So it was much appreciated. So if I guess no other questions, I'd like to thank you and goodbye.